everybody, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, then welcome. My name is Avon Van Hassel. I'm a self-published author, and I'm here every Wednesday to give you tips and tricks on things to try in your writing. This is the last of a 5-part series on character building. Last week we talked about character relationships. Before that we talked about character appearance. Before that we talked about personality, and then the first week was about naming. This week will hopefully be a pretty short one, and it's about conflict. Now, there are 2 types of conflict that most characters encounter, and that's internal and external conflicts. Internal conflict usually refers to things that the character is struggling with that may or may not affect the story, but usually is not directly related to the main plot of the story. What I mean by that is this will be them dealing with something on their own that doesn't necessarily affect the main plot, although it could. So the main plot is usually the external conflict, and I'll get into that in a second. So the main forms of conflict are things like man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, man versus society. And there's man versus the divine, which sometimes involves like gods and magic and that sort of thing. So internal conflict is usually man versus self, because man, the character, is usually battling something that other people may or may not know about. And so it's usually something within himself, like a weakness. Maybe he has a gambling addiction or something like that, or maybe he has an invisible illness, or maybe he has and I say he because default, right? Maybe he has guilt about something that he's done in his past, or he has some sort of something that he's struggling with internally that may or may not affect other people. But you can bring in the other kinds of conflict. So you can have man versus society. Maybe there's something about him that he has to keep hidden away, that society doesn't approve of. There's an aspect to him, who he is as a person, that he can't be his true self out loud about. Then you have things like man versus man. Maybe there's a conflict that he's gotten into with another person, and the other person might not know that they're fighting. Or he's trying to get over a resentment that he has against someone else. Man versus nature. Maybe he has an illness that isn't the primary source of conflict in the story. And then man versus the divine, which I like to include magic in there. Maybe he's got a curse on him that no one knows about, So these are just examples of an internal conflict. Internal conflict is important because it gives the character depth. It gives them something that we can all relate to. We all have secret battles that we're fighting, right? We all have things that are holding us back, and it doesn't necessarily need to be secret. For instance, I'm learning how to roller skate, right? And I have terrible balance. And so it's an internal conflict because it's something that I'm struggling to better myself on. It's not a fight I'm having with anybody else. It's not, society is holding me back. It's my damn ankles are holding me back. So that's an example of an internal conflict. It's something that I'm struggling against that doesn't necessarily affect anybody or anything else. Internal conflicts tend to be the vehicle of character growth. A lot of times you'll have a character who has something wrong with them at the beginning of the story, and then by the end of the story they've overcome it. For one example, Sulat, at the beginning of Magic Beans, has terrible trust issues. She pretty much only trusts Alois, and even then only so far, because he frustrates the crap out of her. But by about the middle of Siren Song, she's starting to learn that there are other people she can kind of sort of confide in. She's starting to make some shallow friendships here and there, and she's starting to be able to kind of step away from him a little bit and be kind of okay. So she's got a long road ahead of her, but part of her internal struggle is her trust issues. So she's working to overcome those things. She's also got PTSD that she's trying to work through, and her trust issues are kind of related to that. A lot of times, these internal struggles will be a subplot, so they will be a big part of the story that will feed into the larger story. A lot of times, perhaps a character's weakness, whatever they're struggling against, will prevent them from taking a step that they need to push the plot forward. So instead of having the courage to take out an enemy when the opportunity arises, the character will stall because of their confidence issues or whatever, and that opportunity will pass them by, and then that character will grow stronger and it'll be a bigger battle later on. Does that make sense? That's sort of how your personal demons can affect the larger story. Internal conflicts tend to be, there's a trend these days towards internal conflict actually being in some ways more important than the external conflict, because the external conflict, you can kind of figure out how that's going to end because that's why we're here. But the internal conflict is where you really get your audience to identify and care about your characters. You get a lot of villains who have detailed and traumatic backstories. You see a big push toward that, toward trying to make villains and antagonists sympathetic. And it's kind of weird because people can just be wrong. They can just have a shitty opinion and act on it in a shitty way. But there is still that sort of like, well, let's hear their side of the story. And that's how you get people to really root for your character, is by having a sympathetic internal struggle. And then when there is growth or a payoff there, that's when people really get invested in the story. External conflict is the driving force of the story. Without external conflict, we don't have a story. Now, external conflict doesn't have to be a big good versus evil, big battle at the end of a story. It can be a small, the example I like to use is someone gets caught in the rain and they have to find shelter. So this is man versus nature, and they're just going along having their little day with whatever their internal struggles are, and it starts raining, and their conflict is, oh no, it's raining, I have to find a solution to this, which if they don't have an umbrella means find a building, right? Now we add internal struggle here by saying this person is super unsteady on their feet. And so while they're heading for shelter, they keep slipping in the rain and they keep falling. And so there's going to be a part of you that's like, oh. And so now you're rooting for this person, right? It's not just somebody who's getting wet and doesn't want to be wet. It's somebody who's fighting this uphill battle while they're trying to get out of the rain, right? So you add that little bit of complexity there. Just a little bit, just a smidge. And then you can have things where, there is the big boss fight at the end, and you've got all these characters who maybe don't get along, so there's that struggle, that layer of conflict added. Maybe some of them don't have great eyesight, so, they're missing shots everywhere. Maybe some of them, got drunk the night before, and so they're missing shots everywhere. So you can have layer and layer and layer of conflict. And they can all be external, it can all be internal. It adds depth and interest, basically. So going back to the other types of conflict, you have man versus nature, man versus society, man versus self, which tends to be internal, but it can be external. They could have, that that scene in Tangled where Rapunzel is like, best day ever, but then she's also like, I'm a terrible daughter. This is an internal struggle that is happening externally. That's man versus self. And then man versus divine is like, Zeus hates that guy. And what are you going to do about it? Or a curse that affects multiple people. These are your usual lines of conflict. And these tend to be bigger areas or bigger topics because that's what drives the story forward. So if you have man versus man, then that's open conflict between two or more people or groups of people. Man versus Society, those tend to be political stories, so you're trying to right some sort of injustice or overthrow a government, that sort of thing. Man versus Nature, those tend to be survival stories. There also is a lot of internal struggle in there because, you know, there's a lot of solitude and quietness in those sorts of stories. And Man versus Self, those tend to be a bit squishy because they do tend to be more about internal struggle than external struggle, but they kind of feed into each other. Going back to just how this affects your character, you have to decide where your character is in the beginning of the story and decide where they fit in with the conflict. So, for instance, Alois, his external struggle is at the beginning of Magic Beans. He's on a job. He and Sulot have been hired to find an item for somebody who wants to sell the item. And so they go on this journey to find the item. They figure out it's part of a much bigger story. So now they're on this journey to deal with this bigger problem. But his internal struggle is that he's got this secret relationship that he's trying to make work. And it's impossible because of 1,000 reasons. But there is an ultimatum. There is one way for this relationship to work. And so he's sort of trying to work toward that in a roundabout. So that's kind of Man versus Man and Man versus Society. But he's got a lot of angst about it, so that's also Man versus Self. And that is what motivates him to be in the sort of lifestyle that allows him to be hired for this sort of a job to go find this thing. So in the end, it works together. He finds the thing, which leads to another thing, which leads to the big fight, which leads to a series of events that solve the conflict that he has internally. But it's a mess. It's all a mess until you get there, because conflict is messy. And that's what makes it interesting, and that's why we care and why we want to read it. So that's why you have to have conflict, and why you need to know the difference between internal and external conflict. Internal conflict is what motivates the character to embark on these external conflicts, but it can also hold them back. So that's where the fun part is figuring how that works. I feel like I talked really fast in this one, and I think it's because it's such a squishy topic. It's so open-ended. It can be anything at any time, and they work together in such complicated ways that I just want to throw all of my ideas at you at one time, and it's a mess. So if you liked this series, this 5-part series on character development, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and leave a comment in the description, in the comments section. I'm going to do the description section. You do the comments section. Like I said, this does it for the series on character building, but next week, I think I'm going to do a video on description in general and how much is necessary for characters and scenes. So it's kind of an appendix to this one and the world building series. If you like this series, go ahead and check out my world building series. I will put it in the eye here. And yeah, I hope you liked it. If this is something that you think can help other people, I know a lot of people who struggle with conflict. Go ahead and share this video, and hopefully it will help them. If you liked any of these videos and you want to see more from me, go ahead and subscribe and hit the bell so that you know when all those other videos are coming out. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.